For 15 years, David Harper's Saturday morning looked exactly the same. Folding chair, tackle box, dock, and a kind of silence that only exists before the rest of the world wakes up. Pine Ridge Lake wasn't just a place to catch fish. It was a reward for a lifetime of work. The one corner of his world where nothing demanded anything from him. Then one Saturday morning, a golf cart rolled onto the dock and handed him a $550 fine. Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, arrived with the entire board behind her, holding a violation notice. She informed David that he was breaking newly adopted HOA fishing regulations and would need to pay the penalty immediately. David didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he asked one simple question. Who actually owns this lake? Karen answered without hesitation. According to her, the HOA controlled all activities on the water and had every right to enforce its rules. The board members nodded in agreement. Nobody produced documentation. Nobody presented a deed. David folded the notice, packed his fishing gear, and drove home. That evening, he opened his laptop and began researching county property records. What started as curiosity quickly became something much larger. The documents told a story the HOA had apparently never bothered to read. The lake itself was not owned by the HOA. It never had been. Years earlier, when the surrounding neighborhood was developed, a private holding company had retained ownership of the lake. The HOA controlled common areas throughout the community, but the water was a completely separate property. David kept digging through public records and discovered something even more interesting. The holding company had recently expressed interest in selling the lake. Most people would have printed the records and marched straight back to the dock. David chose a different approach. He hired a property attorney to verify every document. After reviewing surveys, deeds, and ownership records, the attorney confirmed exactly what David had already found. The HOA had no ownership interest in the lake whatsoever. David then contacted a real estate broker. Over the next several months, while Karen continued discussing community regulations and the board focused on enforcement, David quietly entered negotiations to purchase the property. Survey crews inspected the shoreline. Legal boundaries were verified. Access rights were reviewed. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Pine Ridge Lake was legally available for purchase. David never mentioned a word of it to anyone. He attended meetings, handled paperwork, reviewed contracts, and worked closely with his attorney. When the final closing date arrived, he signed the documents, completed the transaction, and officially became the owner of Pine Ridge Lake. Then, he went right back to fishing. A few days later, David returned to the same dock, carrying the same folding chair and tackle box he had used for years. As expected, Karen arrived soon afterward, clipboard in hand and board members following behind. She began discussing another alleged violation involving fishing activity. David listened patiently and allowed her to finish. Without saying much, he reached into a folder and handed her a document. It was a recorded deed. The atmosphere changed immediately. Karen stared at the paperwork. Board members crowded around to read it themselves. The county recording stamp was clearly visible. So were the signatures. The deed identified David Harper as the owner of Pine Ridge Lake. Not a portion of it, not access rights to it. The entire lake. For several moments, nobody spoke. David calmly explained what months of research had taught him. Property rights work both ways. If ownership determines who has authority to create rules, ownership also determines who has authority to enforce them. The HOA had assumed control over property it didn't own. Shortly afterward, new signs appeared around designated access points. Unlike the previous notices, these signs reflected actual legal ownership and documented access requirements. News spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Residents began reviewing public records for themselves. Many were surprised to discover that David's explanation matched the county documents exactly. Questions soon followed. How had the HOA been regulating a lake it didn't own? Why had nobody verified ownership years earlier? How did a simple fishing fine reveal something so significant? The HOA called emergency meetings and sought legal guidance. Their attorney reviewed the records and reached the same conclusion everyone else had already reached. Ownership belonged entirely to David. There was no legal challenge available and no overlook clause that changed the outcome. As the initial shock faded, several residents approached David directly. Unlike previous conversations, these meetings were respectful and constructive. They weren't interested in arguments. They simply wanted to know whether there was a reasonable path forward for the community. David listened, together with attorneys and neighborhood representatives. He helped develop a formal access agreement. The arrangement respected his ownership rights while providing structured access for residents. Fishing areas were designated. Community activities were accommodated. Clear expectations replaced years of assumptions. The result worked better than anyone expected. Families continued enjoying the waterfront. Anglers returned to their favorite fishing spots. Community gatherings remained part of life around the lake. The difference was that everything now rested on documented agreements rather than unofficial claims. Over time, many residents came to view the entire situation as an important lesson. The conflict had never really been about fishing. It had been about facts, ownership, and the importance of verifying information before enforcing authority. David often reflected on how differently things could have ended. If he had simply paid the fine, nothing would have changed. If he had argued at the dock instead of researching public records, the discovery might never have happened. Instead, one unfair penalty motivated him to ask a single question. That question exposed years of mistaken assumptions and ultimately led to an opportunity nobody else had noticed. One evening, after the access agreement was finalized, David returned to the dock alone. He unfolded his chair, cast his line into the water, and watched the sunset spread across the lake. The view looked exactly the same as it always had. The water reflected the evening sky. The trees along the shoreline stood motionless in the fading light. The fish certainly didn't care who owned the property. Everything appeared unchanged. Yet, the story behind that view was completely different. The HOA issued a $550 fine, hoping to enforce authority. Instead, it inspired the man receiving it to research the facts, uncover the truth, and ultimately purchase the very lake he had been accused of fishing on. In the end, the most expensive mistake the HOA ever made wasn't the fine itself. It was assuming nobody would ever check who actually owned the lake.